Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation as part of the Industry Insight webinar series. The topic this time is the evolution of cybersecurity, contracted attacks, and targeting attorneys. Speaking today will be Mark Sangster. Mark is an industry security strategist and cybersecurity evangelist who researches, speaks, and writes about cybersecurity as it relates to regulations, ethical obligations, data breach incident response, management. Mark's 20-year career has established with industry giants like Intel, Cisco, and BlackBerry, where he worked on the first secure devices for government agencies. Mark continues to build mutually beneficial relationships with regulatory agencies and industry associations, drawing on a strong technical aptitude and intuitive understanding of information security. As an ILTA Council member, Mark regularly attends legal tech conferences, delivering talks and workshops, including a 23-stop ILTA Roadshow in 2017, and leads topical webinars focusing on the cybersecurity challenges facing the legal industry. Mark is also a member of the American Bar Association, Income Security Advocacy Center, and the Association of Legal Administrators, and a National Law Journal Award recipient in 2016. The presentation today will be followed by a Q&A. Please enter your questions into the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. All questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We're recording this webinar and we will be sending a video and a follow-up email in a few days. We'll also post the video on our blog at www.lawtechnologytoday.org. Thank you all for joining us. We'll now begin the webinar.
Great, thank you, Austin. Thanks very much for the intro today. Today we're going to talk about the contracted attacks and really how cybersecurity is evolving. And I will be drawing on a lot of the Security Operations Center data that we have that we gather from the 24/7 monitoring that we provide for our clients. So we're looking for the things that have already gotten into their network, and then when we find them, we're trying to quickly detect them, contain them rapidly to reduce the risk and the costly outcome that can occur from significant security events. Or worst case, breaches. So we've got a half an hour today, so buckle up your seatbelts here. It's going to be a fast ride. So real quick, pulling on these comparisons, I always like to set the stage here with law firms. Law firms, you sit somewhere about neck and neck with financial institutions when it comes to the cybersecurity hygiene that you exhibit. And that's really, really good news because frankly, financial institutions certainly have, I'd say, a 3 to 5 year advantage over you, primarily because of, the old adage that, people rob banks because that's where the money is, but also because of that, as a reflection, they have very stringent regulatory requirements, and therefore, they're to some degree forced to carry a higher standard when it comes to the reasonable care that they provide within their industry. So the fact that you're sort of, on par, I think is very much a good news story and certainly reflects a dramatic improvement that we've seen over the last few years. Now, again, I pulled some information from our Security Operations Center here, just to give you an idea of the volume, right? So if we look at the red column here of law firms, 750 attorneys in a 20 office we considered large, and I pulled some data there. And then I also did a snapshot against 50 attorneys in one office, and really want to try and give you sort of the anchors of both ends of the same spectrum. Now, in the security speak at the top of the column there is security traffic in that first row. That's all the data that we have to look at. So on a 90-day basis, you're generating nearly 3 million events in a large firm, so about 1 million a month, versus a fraction of that, almost 50th, which is for the 65K at small office. But as we move down through that security funnel, going through alerts and types of incidences and notifications, and then actual actions that we've had to take, you see that the numbers get a lot closer. So while I think the size of the firm is realistically is a linear representation of the amount of traffic it's going to generate, right? People surfing content and downloading files, etc. That makes sense. But as you get closer to the bottom of the funnel, the dangerous end of the funnel, you see that the gap dramatically narrows for that small firm. And so we go from a 50 to 1 down to about a 3 or 4 to 1. And then when it comes to major escalations, in this case, they were identical, and I'll explain why, because this was a very targeted attack. And that's really the problem that we can see, is that while the hygiene that many law firms now hold themselves to is actually comparably much better than many industries, so you do see slightly less of other sort of nuisance types of security issues. Unfortunately, you do see about a 30% higher load when it comes to sort of targeted malware-based attacks and malicious code attacks, which is I think, unfortunately, the the results of, when you do a good job, you get more work, right? So the reality is you've eliminated the nuisance and you've reduced the noise of the background radiation of the internet. Unfortunately, what that leaves you with is the guys who are far more aggressive and are willing to be far more persistent about getting into your network to steal whatever information it is that they seek. And why that's so concerning, of course, is that law firms, unlike many other industries, you form the nexus or the hub of the economy, right? You help nations and you write state level law, you help interpret that law for clients, you work with regulators both on the investigatory side and then also on the defense side with insurance claims, et cetera, working with cybersecurity companies like myself, and then getting down to the institutional and the private investors who, of course, provide the money that fuels the innovation, the technology that our economy thrives upon in these new industries, whatever they are, right, across biotech and transportation and new high tech and so on. At the end of the day, you have access to all sorts of privileged information. And because of that, it makes you a bit of a one-stop shop when it comes to picking up the types of information that can be used in some way to effectively fuel a larger criminal activity. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. So we're here today to talk about the evolution of cyber attacks, and let's do exactly that. And I think over the last few years, what we've seen is a transition from a very opportunistic approach to one that's more contracted and more targeted. So the stages that I've seen us go through about, for the last, let's say decade or so, if not more, we've seen what I call opportunistic and types of attacks. This is the unfocused phishing campaigns that use the typical brand names, whether it's travel agents, airlines, courier services, hotels, or our favorite online services such as Netflix and eBay. In these examples, they're able to play the sort of a high volume, low success rate type of game, right? It's just a numbers game. If you put enough into the mill, you will eventually get something worthwhile out of it. And of course, when they do, it's very transactional, right? It's pay a flat fee, about $300 and some equivalents of cryptocurrency, and that's it, right? And that's why it's very transactional. Now, through that activity, what they did realize, of course, is that there's far more lucrative targets. So in the beginning, perhaps they captured, grandma who has the picture of her grandchildren and her tax returns, and she just wants her files unlocked, or they hit a law firm, or they hit a hospital and they lock down medical records. And as they did that in the last 5 years, what they've discovered is, of course, the ability for individuals to pay is probably locked down at that minimal $300 level. However, the larger kinds of institutions such as law firms and hospitals and government agencies, et cetera, well, you have more wherewithal, and therefore often you'll pay more. And what we do see when ransoms were very popular and payment was very prevalent as a solution was that instead of paying $300, you're paying just south of $30,000. So you've got a couple orders of magnitude there, an increase. And the way they've gone about that is they started targeting those industries. So instead of using very generic type of attacks, they've now focused and they've used something that effectively will emotionally trigger you and get a response from that specific industry. So a simple example I use in healthcare, because I get this all the time: how would you target a healthcare institution? I would basically send a PDF document that fakes that it comes from a law firm and purports to contain a PDF of a complaint that's registered for a malpractice suit. Why? Because every doctor, that's their nightmare, and that's something they're going to click on, right? Same thing with lawyers. What do we have to look at? And I'll show you an example. Now, the third stage, I think, is really the more despicable one, and the one where we really see danger here, because we're moving from, now it's industry targeted. I know I'm going after law firms. I'm going to charge more money to get your files unlocked. And if I'm really smart, I'm not locking down laptops. I'm locking down very active servers, which once inside the network is extremely easy to do based on bandwidth, transactions, number of connections, and so on. To the contracted, I'm no longer going after a law firm. I am going after, hook, line, and sinker, the law firm, and that's it. And why am I doing that? That's potentially because of the type of practice that they have, or it may be because of a very publicized case that they're involved in that may be politically charged, or I know that it's a highly lucrative case, and if I can get insider information, I may be able to do something with that. And I'm going to go out on a limb here for a little bit, but I truly do believe that the Panama Papers and the Appleby Papers and the Paradise Papers, so Mossack Fonseca and Appleby respectively, were targets of this. So I think Mossack Fonseca may have been accidental, right? Somehow this got leaked. People didn't understand the potential value of things like tax returns and business registrations in tax havens. I think Appleby, unfortunately, became a sort of a zero-day attack victim of that targeted practice. So that very contracted sort of approach that says, I know exactly the kind of information you have. I know it's highly sensitive. I know your reputation is critical to you. So guess what? I'm going to steal all that information. I'm going to threaten to make it public. You're going to pay me a big extortion fee to not do that. And when they refuse to pay, documents got released, right? And again, that's speculation, but I have seen this in other places. So it fits that model. And I think ultimately we're going to see what I call the Pandora Papers, which will be a replication or effectively a commoditized spread of this where multiple firms will be hit. Now, this is a simple example that I wanted to show you here. This was an email from, it's pushing, it's 18 months old now, but it tells the story, which is, this is an email that went around in 3 states on the East Coast, including New York. It purported to come from the Office of the State Attorney, of course, not the District Attorney, but people weren't paying attention. It claimed to have a complaint with a PDF attachment, which of course, outlined the complaint and also carried malware on it as well, and a payload of ransomware and some keystroke loggers. Unfortunately, there were enough indicators in there to tell you that this was fake. So the fact that it came from an Outlook.com address, not a .gov address, that it didn't come from the district attorney, state's attorney, et cetera. Nonetheless, because of the emotive nature of it, several hundred attorneys clicked on it, and their firms were affected. In some cases, it was minor. In some cases, it took them down for up to 2 weeks, and they lost $500,000 in billable hours, et cetera. In another case, a company lost what they believe was 700,000 billable hours, and that law firm is actually now suing their insurer because when they made a claim against their business disruption insurance, the insurance company in question basically said, sorry, this happened because of a technology outage. You are insured for $10,000 per device that's affected. There were 2 affected, so do your math. We're giving you $20K. That one's now in court in Rhode Island, and we'll see where that goes. This is a bulletin that was put out by law enforcement just recently, in fact, just about a month ago, that actually talks about how they believe that a Chinese threat group, one of these APT, which is, Advanced Persistent Threat, that's the cool code names that cybersecurity geeks love to give these groups. Anyway, APT19 has actually been targeting law firms. And the reason they're doing that is not to get to the law firm themselves per se, but to use them as a vector and a supply chain attack into larger financial institutions that, of course, then have the money. And the idea here is that by conducting this kind of espionage, they could steal information that they could then use to, in some way, manipulate the markets, right? So I could either do, I could use that insider information to front run the market, as the SEC would call it, and be able to make trades because I know as an example, a biotech firm is about to release results of its FDA testing. Well, on Friday, if I can steal those results and they passed, I know their stock will go up on Monday. However, if I know that they failed, their stock is going to go down on Monday, right? And I know what will happen with the investors and the PE firms that are involved and so on. And I can front run that trade. And that's, of course, unfortunately, what happened in the case from, again, about 2 years ago now, was unfortunately Cravath and Wheel-Goetschel. And I want to stop here and make a comment that, in any of the cases where these law firms are named, in no way is there an implied criticism of their security abilities or skills. These firms are being hit by 0 days, right? We're good at responding to things we've seen. We're not so good at responding to things that we have to predict. And I don't think anyone's in particular here to blame. They unfortunately were, as I said, the 0 day. They were the first ones in this. And so, that's just it's unfortunate timing or unfortunate, wrong place at the wrong time kind of scenario. Again, this is not in any way a criticism of their abilities or skills. But again, in this case, the SEC investigated it, charged 3 Chinese citizens with hacking these firms to do exactly what I described, stealing FDA results, stealing press releases from high-tech firms that they could then use to trade the stock and front run it. They believed, I believe it's $30 million, they think that they made in profit. They charged them $9 million in fines. Now, I doubt these gentlemen are going to show up in the lower district of Manhattan to be arrested. So it's a little bit of, theater for the public to look like we're taking some action here. But the lessons we need to look at is that in this case, law firms certainly, go back to my thesis, you are the hub of the economy. And as such, you're a container for all sorts of valuable information that many criminals may want to target. So never think that your practice is innocuous and think, well, we do family law or we're doing tax filings or whatever it is. The reality is you have valuable information. So to the heart of this story really is the next story I'm going to tell you, and this is a fictitious name, Wolfram Heart, for anybody out there who's a sci-fi aficionado. You may recognize the firm from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but that's what it's from. And this is a true story. The details on this slide are all the technical details and timing are factual. The name of the firm is not, and the story behind it. And in this case, what happened is this firm, there was a public statement about the firm landing a deal with a large arms manufacturer. That arms manufacturer had a large contract with the Ukraine because of the tension in the Crimea between Russia and the Ukrainian government, and the toppling of that government. Russia, officials come out and say, well, we think this is a provocative act on the part of the United States, and anyone involved in this is going to pay. I know it sounds ridiculous, but this does happen. And at that point, anyway, they were targeted. Now, the reality was, at the end of the day, they were attempting to get at the attorney who actually was involved in this work and was heading it. And they were able to, by effectively in public Wi-Fi skimming VPN credentials, they were able to get in. Unfortunately, the firm had a very flat network. From there, they were able to migrate and move around. Users had administrative controls. They were able to create new accounts. They, by the end of the day, had controlled domain controllers. So they had control of their network. They had also control of their Exchange server for email and their OWA server, which is the web version of Outlook. And from there, they were able to capture credentials. They were able to access various files and so on. And they were doing that. And I'll show you a second timeline in just a second, but it didn't take very long. It took 12 hours to do most of this damage. And it only took 2 or 3 days. What was unfortunate too, is that they then bragged, the bad guys here bragged about it on Twitter, showed screen caps of things they were doing and so on. And unfortunately, because of that, of course, what you don't want is, this type of story is exactly what, CNN or the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or Fox News or whoever wants to carry. And so this becomes a very public issue. And so you quickly, in an incident response, move from dealing with this internally, perhaps dealing with the affected clients, to suddenly having to do crisis management and have one of your senior partners being interviewed on CNN at 6 p.m., right? And that is certainly not a position you want to be in, particularly in this kind of story. Luckily, we were able to avoid most of that. Now, we did detect this very quickly. We saw some questionable behavior on the network. When we did, we started digging in. Now, reality is we were also playing catch up with the bad guys, and we did have to do that. However, by catching this quickly, this didn't go on. It didn't metastasize, and it didn't take months to discover. And that's really the point. And then once you get to that stage of, okay, something has occurred here, it allows you to rapidly respond to the incident, to determine whether or not this is an escalation, whether or not you have to go into a full breach mode, whether or not or to what extent you may have to report this to either a regulator, depending on where you're working or in what industry, or to law enforcement. Now, in this case, we turned this over to law enforcement, collected all the forensics we could, obviously, because this is a fairly serious incident, and they would go off and investigate that. And they are continuing to do so, and we're never helpful. We provide additional information. The point, again, here is that we've evolved in our attacks, and this was contracted. They went after a specific, not only a specific firm, they went after a specific attorney. And I'm going to give you another piece of this story, which is it's not just about exfiltrating or stealing information. It's also about planting it. So if I want to destroy someone's reputation, all I need to do is get on that network. And if it's not properly traceable, I can leave things there that could cause incredible damage. So think about any kind of contraband material, right? Or stolen documents or something like that. And of course, I own your email system. So I'm accidentally going to take one of those pictures or files, and I'm going to accidentally email that to someone else in the firm, who, when they see it, is going to have but no choice to contact HR, contact a managing partner, and potentially contact law enforcement. And in that instant, someone's reputation and personal and professional can be destroyed and irrevocably damaged. Now, the good news in this story is a lot of this was highly preventable, right? So simple security policies may have flagged or prevented much of this, right? User education would have helped. So when they were originally phished, we may have been able to say, you know what, guys, now we're seeing more than one person being phished. That twigs that perhaps we're being targeted. Let's everybody lock down. Let's everybody change their credentials if they're not sure, or force those credentials ought to be changed at the administrative level. Personal devices were used. There wasn't control in those. Multi-factor authentication on the VPN could have stopped it or slowed it. And then lots of other things could have been done, right? Logging, DLP, so data loss prevention tools, so that when highly critical files were accessed by someone who shouldn't be, then that would trigger, right? 24/7 monitoring, right? So seeing what's going on in the network, and that's a near real-time type of play, and maybe it isn't real-time, but you've only got, seconds lag, and it's not like you have months in lag to actually discover after the fact that this has occurred. So how do we go about preventing these kind of things? I've given you some simple examples from that case. Obviously, they're very anecdotal and certainly specific to that one instance. But the ABA, our hosts today, offer the Cybersecurity Handbook, which came out. This is in its second edition, which recently came out, I think, in December of last year, so it's pretty fresh. The second edition is certainly more robust than the first, and again, credit goes to the editors and to the authors here. It's also, I think, done a very good job of aligning to other regulatory authorities, such as Department of Financial Services in New York, to HIPAA for the protection of protected healthcare information, and also GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Rules, which of course launch in 2 days from the EU, and of course it affects more than just EU-based companies or firms, because it's actually about citizenship. So if you have EU citizens in your clientele, then this is an issue you have to address, and so on. And I think it's really good that they've made that alignment, because ultimately, at the end of the day, what it does is it streamlines your ability as a law firm to meet the requirements of these various standards. And ultimately, as your practice grows, or as you deal with clientele in these different regulated industries, you're going to have to meet them all, right? So the fact that they're getting closer and closer to harmonization is frankly a good thing. It also, again, if I go back to my small and large firms here, it does a good job of sort of hitting the high notes around what are some of the top 10 considerations of large firms, right? And I definitely think here that the two that I would definitely hit on is, conducting a cybersecurity risk profile, right? And in that, you really have to, number two, evaluate your client-specific data and what those requirements are. And I've already alluded to that when it comes to the regulatory angles, but making sure you understand what those obligations are as well. What we're also seeing is the appointment of a chief security officer, a chief privacy officer, a chief data officer, whatever you want to call it, whatever the moniker is. The reality is, what you're saying is, you need to have a qualified, skilled individual who understands what the obligations and the requirements are to keep that data protected, right? Has a good way of being able to determine those risk models, to put together policies, procedures, tools, and technology and people to adequately protect that data and understand what your reporting requirements are. And it gets complicated. What it does mean, though, for larger firms is that you're moving away from the person who busses the table, right? Seats people at the table, brings them their food, cleans up afterwards, hands them their bill, and shakes their hand when they leave, right? You cannot have someone who doesn't necessarily have security as a primary expertise or skill set and is effectively wearing many hats. And I know many law firms have that. So as you move into those more regulated industries, based on the types of attacks we're seeing, you're really at a point where you have to decide what level of expertise you have, and and how do you put, as I say, a skilled, qualified individual in the driver's seat who's ultimately responsible for it. Now, with smaller law firms, of course, it's not that simple, and certainly most of the regulators don't require, for example, that you have some kind of head of state when it comes to security, right? Or that can be outsourced. But it's still, I think the ABA handbook still does a great job of outlining some of the basics that you should do. And you just have to think about right-sizing this, right? So, number 4, establishing cybersecurity acceptable usage policies. That's may not look as comprehensive and as detailed as what a much larger firm may have around data control and DLP and access privileges and all sorts of stuff. But, I think some basics in place make sense, right? Like using a VPN, for example, when you log in a public Wi-Fi, like a hotel, right? There are simple things that you can do. And I think that's critical. And as these types of attacks, of course, become more nefarious, as we see more cases end up in court, whether it's insurance claims and clashes, whether it's class action suits, whatever it is, as this increases, and we're certainly seeing that, really you're in a position where you have to prove reasonable care. So you want to demonstrate that you understood the risks, that in some way you've documented and mitigated those risks, and that you're living to it, right? And certainly that's what we see with many investigations now, is they're not looking for the basics. They're not saying, show me your policies and procedures, because frankly, they know you can download a template off of the website and do a copy and replace, put your name in. What they are looking for is documented evidence that you live it. So things like partner and board meetings where you've discussed cybersecurity risks, where you've established and set budget, the minutes and meetings of your security leader and their committee, as again, you've done the same thing, testing results, resumes of your talent pool, as well as another one that I've seen asked, because they want to determine whether or not your senior security people come from that background, or it turns out they come from, say, a financial background, which is very common, right? The CFO somehow gets lumped with this. While the CFO is a very talented individual and certainly is the person who is going to be primary when it comes to the fiduciary care of an organization and a business institution, at the same time, again, may not have the technical and security wherewithal, to do the right job, right? To some degree, you're setting them up to fail. Now, the third part of this that I wanted to touch on, and this is not covered in the ABA book, they do actually have a section on third-party vendors, and I think I highlighted it in the previous slide. But what I wanted to show you was in New York, the Department of Financial Services, their cybersecurity rules and regulations, which have been rolling out over the last year or so and still will continue into 2019, have a really good subset of requirements when it comes to your vendors. And remember, you yourself are part of a supply chain, right? So your clients, you're the vendor to your clients. And if it's a larger bank, they definitely look at you as the vendor, right? But again, for you, you have to think about what some of the risks are here. And in fact, in the story I told you earlier, much of the attacks actually occurred through remote administrative tools, which were third-party tools that were used by the firm. Completely awesome tools, very legitimate tools, leaders in their industry. So I don't think they did anything wrong by selecting them. Unfortunately, they became the vector in the attack. And so you really have to consider what are the risks that they generate. And I think the big piece in this, and this is the lesson that we all need to take away, is the contractual obligations that we then create. So what requirements do you need for your vendors? And this is the exact same that you see large banks doing with law firms. I need you to set up, 1 to 5 in security. Otherwise, sorry, you can't do the work for us. Same idea, right? And then I think the big one too is the notification of a security event, documenting and contractually obligating them on A, what constitutes an event, B, how long they have to report it to you, let's say 72 hours, because that's what it should be, and C, at what point does that clock start ticking? And in fact, if anybody would like a copy of it, I have a documentation on GDPR, again, the General Data Protection Rules from Europe, but they do a great job when it comes to the 2 articles they've written around A, notification to a regulator, and B, notification to your clientele, on really assessing what constitutes an incident or a breach, when does the clock start ticking, and some really good examples. And this actually came out of the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office in the United Kingdom. And this is basically Britain's privacy officers, or privacy office, I should say. And they've done a great job of labeling and laying this all out. And if nothing else, it makes, you may not be under GDPR compliance, but it's a really good model for how you can set this up with your vendors. Now, in the end, and I'm just being cognizant of the time here, we're coming up on 2:30. The other good news here, and this goes back to my point about catching things quickly, is that the Aberdeen Group is a good analyst firm, and they took what's to some degree considered the holy grail of cybersecurity research, is the Verizon Data Breach Report. Every year it comes out in the spring, and it goes through, it's this compendium, it's like the farmer's almanac of cybersecurity events. And it's a fantastic resource of data that we can use. But what they did is they actually ran a financial simulation on it to determine what the outcomes would be. And what they found was when you could 2x your ability to detect and respond to an event. So let me flip this around for you. If you could cut the amount of time it takes to detect something and respond to it by 50%, so cut it in half, you reduce the actual business outcome by 70%. And some simple numbers I can give you is it takes several $100s to clean up a user account. So you think about somebody, again, their credentials get harvested somewhere and you have to reset their accounts and you have to do some monitoring and checking. It's a few $100. You up that to a business system that's been compromised, so an email server, you're now talking about $25,000. And if it does get to the point where you're doing some reporting, even basic, it's now about $125,000. So it very quickly escalates. And so the lesson again is setting up a system that's, you know, your early detection tripwire system, right? It's not going to stop everything. The point is catching it though, and catching it quickly and not letting it metastasize. So we're just coming to the end here, but I want to give you a simple analogy from our grade 6 science again is, I hope everybody recognizes Roy G. Biv, right? The visible spectrum or light as we would see it. That a lot of times what you see in security and what's going on is just this, it's just a small part of what's actually happening. It's all the other things that you can't. It's all the other things that you have to infer, right? I can't see infrared light, but things get hot when it sits in it. I just got back from a beach vacation, didn't wear enough sunscreen, and I, you know, found out the consequences of you know, human flesh being in ultraviolet light, right? These sorts of things are not the things we can directly see. They're not being caught by prevention systems like firewalls or whatever. They're getting through, but the telltale signs are there. When you correlate all that information, when you look at the logs that may be generated in your SIM and other pieces and doing some investigations, you can actually infer what's happening. And when you see some of these things happening, that's where you can strike quickly and stop it. So you really, it's getting everybody out of that mentality of, well, if it didn't appear in a log, if it didn't appear in a report, it doesn't exist, because that's patently not true. And, you know, if I carry this analogy a little further, which is slightly, you know, perhaps it's a little too much showmanship here, but realistically, if I took the Golden Gate Bridge, it's about 9,000 feet long, and the percentage of visible light in that entire electromagnetic spectrum I just showed you is, you know, about 0.0035%, right? Which means you can only see about 30% of that bridge if you are highly relying on things that are tripping with alerts, right? So there's a lot more to it. And again, there's logs, there's all sorts of good correlation systems that you can pull together to really figure out what's happening there. And you really have to depend on them, because any one system is not going to catch 100% of attacks. The other thing to remember is only 50% of attacks are based on malware, which means the other 50% aren't going to trip anything because there is no alarm, right? There is nothing, there's no signature, there's not something that goes, okay, that's A, B, and C, that's an indicator of a compromise, so I'm going to flag that. If A, B, and F goes through, often it gets passed through and it isn't detected. So with that, I know we're just coming to a quick wrap up, but along with the GDPR documents, and if anybody would like a copy of the ABA Cybersecurity Handbook, please contact afterwards. I believe Austin has the contact information for you. We'll buy you or get you a copy. But I also have the Security Event Management Playbook document, which is a comprehensive document that we actually use, like in that incident, that story that I told you of Wolfram Heart, that we go through in great detail. And as you can see on the left, it actually goes through a comprehensive list of very typical attacks and what you would do and how that gets triggered and when you alert and who's involved, et cetera. So anybody would like a copy, please follow up and we will certainly get that to you.